So we're back in X-Plane 11, and today we're in the RW Designs Twin Otter version 2. This was just released about a week ago, so I grabbed that and I've been having a bit of a play, and I'm going to take a quick look at it. I'm going to compare it with version 1, and in truth this is not going to be a very long comparison, because actually it's not that much. Well, I will qualify this, but in my estimation and for the value that this aircraft provides to me, it's not really that much of an advance on version 1. Now, the qualification on that is it really depends what you want out of an aircraft, and I think it also depends on where you're coming from. I'm coming to this from FSX and the Twin Otter Extended. People coming from X-Plane have been very poorly served with aircraft in general, but with Twin Otters in particular, and so we'll see things differently. The other thing is, what do you want out of an aircraft? Obviously I fly my aircraft from the hardware controls and the hardware panel that I've built, although I do make use of the virtual cockpit. So for me, things like the external appearance of the aircraft, which is, I have no complaints about that, but to me it's an irrelevance. So to hear that this is an all new model built from the ground up, featuring 4K textures and all of that stuff, is largely irrelevant to me. I guess the texture quality for the interior may be included in that description, and I have to say that the virtual cockpit is significantly better. In fact, it's worlds better than version 1. So that's an improvement right off the bat that I can benefit from. The interior is well, I hesitate to say it's on a par with the Twin Otter Extended, because it's not, but it's in the same ballpark, shall we say. The version 1 interior was rubbish, frankly. Now again, I don't want to be too unkind about this, because when I looked at version 1 there were some artifacts that I think were down to the fact that that aircraft wasn't designed for X-Plane 11. So the illumination of the panel, you may remember if you watched that video, was an issue. Those issues seem to have gone. The panel illumination works as you'd expect it. The texture qualities, as I say, are very much better. Some things in the virtual cockpit that weren't even there, that were missing, are now there. So we have, in particular, the trim wheel is modelled and is visible, so you have a trim indicator to see where your elevator trim is set. What else can I say? There's jazz that you don't really need, which is you can select the colour of the, I don't know what you call it, the kind of upholstery of the of the lagging of the roof and the inside of the door panels and things. You can change the colour of that if you care about such things. The panel is modelled with some scuffs and some wearing, which is kind of, it's done reasonably well. The gauges are much clearer, I have to say, as well. So lighting aside, the gauges are much clearer. The layout of the panel is changed as well, so some things like the Autopilot panel's been moved over, so it's more in your line of sight. There's some changes in the detail of the radios and so on. So in terms of how the aircraft looks from the virtual cockpit and the ergonomics, in terms of how readable the gauges are and so on, that's certainly much better than it was in version 1. And so functionally, in terms of the layout of the gauges, the specifics of the gauges provided, that's incrementally better as well. But coming back to what I value in an aircraft versus what perhaps other people value in a payware aircraft, those things are really going to colour the overall impression of the aircraft. And in my case, I'm most interested in flying this somewhat realistically, and that means modelling of systems is important to me. And I suppose the first thing to say is the degree of systems modelling really hasn't changed very much from version 1. There is a claim in the description of this aircraft that it has a custom electrical system, for example. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and the only systems that are really modelled are the Autopilot, the GPS, which is for free. The GPS is built into X-Plane 11 in the first place, but the Autopilot and well, things like the ILS and the navigation systems. Again, those things are built into X-Plane and those are piggybacked. Now there's some other things that people are going to celebrate in this, and I can't knock that. The aircraft is equipped to integrate third-party GPS units. I can't remember which ones exactly, maybe the Reality XP units, I think. So I haven't really looked into that because it's not something I want to do, but I think it's the modern GPSs from RXP, Reality XP at least, and I'm presuming that means they can be integrated into the virtual cockpit if you want to fly that way. I use the GNS 530, which I have on my external, so this is the 2D pop-up essentially, which I've got on an external monitor controlled by my hardware panel. If I was using something like the GTN 750 or whatever it's called, the latest one, you know, I'd do the same. I'd have it on an external touch screen rather than in the virtual cockpit. Now the flight model, I don't know if there's been any changes to the flight model. There's no detectable changes that are really obvious. If you read the wording of the description of this aircraft on the websites that sell it, I think it says the model is completely rebuilt from the ground up. Now that doesn't say the flight model, it means the model of the aircraft. So the physical appearance and the textures and so on. It makes some comments about the flight model and you know, custom wing cambers or something like that. Now it doesn't actually seem to say that the version 1 model didn't have those things. So anyway, I would expect that the version 1 flight model and the version 2 flight model are the same. They may have been tweaked somewhat, and you know, there's not too much to complain about. It flies okay. We'll look at a little bit of the detail of that. Okay, so here we are again at Fullerton Municipal Airport in Southern California. We're going to jump in, well, we're in the Twin Otter, we're going to go for a quick ride. We're going to look at just a little bit of the virtual cockpit and some of the systems before we go for a ride. I'm not going to do this in any exhaustive detail. You need to look at this video alongside my original look at the version 1 of the RW Designs Twin Otter, because in many ways not a lot's changed, so I'll make reference to that video as well. I'm going to manipulate everything from the mouse, same deal as before. I've got the Twin Otter panel set up, but it's a partial panel. You know, that's why it looks so odd. Everything's lit up where it shouldn't be. The only thing that's really functional on this panel is the 6-pack, so I've got my airspeeds, artificial horizon, nav instruments, and a couple of those work as well. And of course I've got the controls set up so I can fly it somewhat easily, and I think I've got the flaps, and that's about it. Let's go through the startup. In fact, before we do that, let's just have a look at the cockpit. You know, the cockpit is okay. We've got some dings and scuffs and things. The textures are somewhat nicer than before. The instruments are clearer, and the organisation of the instruments is somewhat different. I can't remember exactly how the layout compares. We've got a different artificial horizon there. This is a kind of an LCD digital one, which I liked. The old one was better in my view. It wasn't great, but it was, you know, it was more of an old-fashioned gauge. The Autopilot's moved over here. That's kind of where it is in the Aerosoft model as well. What else? Can't think what else has moved. Oh, down here we've actually got the trim wheel is now modelled, and that's a trim indicator, so we can see where the trim is set. It's set far forward there at the minute. I need to wind it back. We've got the rudder trim. I can't remember if we had a rudder trim indicator before, but we've got that. Oh, I've got that hooked up as well. Now that takeoff trim setting doesn't look right to me. That should, as far as I know, the takeoff setting should be out to the right somewhere, but you know, I'm not going to quibble with that. What else do we have? There's a checklist function now. If you click on this little thing in the pocket, you get a menu up. One of the things on that menu, I'm not going to look at anything on this menu other than toggling the checklist. That comes up. That's it's a basic checklist. You can go through this. You know, it's somewhat helpful, if somewhat meaningless at the end of the day. Okay, I'm going to say two things about this checklist which I think are significant. One is if you try and drag it off the screen onto a secondary monitor, that doesn't work. So I've got 3 independent views here, as you can in X-Plane 11. So that's just a rough edge. The other thing I'm going to say about this, which is more of a philosophical observation, that de Havilland logo there is squashed, and that may seem like an inconsequential detail to you, but to me that's indicative of the attention to detail that's gone into, or hasn't gone into, the construction of this aircraft. You know, a lot of work's gone into it, but it's let down over and over and over again by the details, and the fact that that logo has been, that should be circular. It's the same logo that's on my hat, and it's not. And it's not because the window's been resized, because when you resize it, the aspect ratio remains the same. So I offer you that observation for what it's worth. That's all we're going to look at in terms of what's new in the virtual cockpit. Let's start this baby up and talk about some things as we go along. Right off the bat, I've noticed something here. This ignition switch is a guarded switch. The switch guards in this model look a little bit unorthodox, and what's interesting to me, and wrong in my estimation, is if you lift that guard up, that switch, the point about these guards is you cannot have the guard closed and the switch in the up position. Now, so there's 2 things wrong here. That shouldn't be possible. That switch is in the up position, and the second thing that's wrong is that ignition is on manual as a default. Well, I mean, this is arguably doesn't really make sense, because that switch would be wherever you left it when you shut down the aircraft, but as a default that should be normal ignition, not manual ignition, which is also known as continuous ignition. I'm going to say more about that in a while. And the guarded switches, you know, there's more of those down here on the test panel, or you can hide the yoke in this version. I'm not sure how you do it actually. Oh no, you press the Y key, that hides the yoke. That's kind of handy for now. So we've got guarded switches down here as well. They've got that same sort of slightly unorthodox looking structure. And the other thing I've noticed is those switches are modelled back to front. They're all in the up position with the guard down. And they should be in the down position. You know, in those switches. Well, again, I'm going from the twin Otter extended. That may be modelled wrong, but I don't think it is. I have much more confidence that that one is modelled correctly. You know, the switches are down for off, up for on. Now it may be that there's a different kind of guarded switch that works differently, but you know, the switches that I have, the real life switches I have on my panel, the point is if you put the switch up and you put the guard down, it flips the switch into the off position. You know, another thing to say about those switches down there, there is one. Does this go with the batteries off? Let me see. Okay, well, a number of things to say there. That all the AC, all the DC power is off there. The fire detection test probably shouldn't work with the DC power off, but given that it does, you can trigger that test, and then you have to go down to the fire bell mute, flip the guard up, flip the switch. Now it's really hard to do that. I mean, I'm actually scooted down in my seat, if you like, here already. So you'd normally be at kind of this kind of height. So look down there, especially if the yoke is there, flip that guard up, flip the switch to test. I'm not able to do it. The only way I can really do that is to scoot all the way down, and so that works. But now that works, but it's meaningless that it works, because the fire detection system is never going to fail. It's very hard to actually use, so you're likely to do it once as a novelty and you'll never do it again. What else? The fact that that's modelled where there's some other things that are far more important aren't modelled is important or is significant. And finally, the fact that that functions with the DC power off. Yeah, again, I'm not going to labour the point. It would have been better to put that effort into other areas of the sim, shall we say. Okay, back to the startup. We're going to put the DC master switch on, and we're going to flip to battery. Now I'm going to come back to this in a little while, but for now that has activated the electrical stuff in the aircraft. Now the GNS 530 has come on. That well, actually I've left all the radios switched on, but you can switch those off. I'm not going to switch them all off because it's laborious. You can't switch the GNS 530 off. You should be able to. There is a switch to do it, but it doesn't switch off. So that's always on. There's that new artificial horizon, by the way. Still has no flight director bars. That's a criticism you'll recall when we looked at the Autopilot in the version 1. But anyway, we've got DC power for now. So we've got some caution lights. So we put the props forward. So we put the fuel pumps on down here. As far as I can tell, there's no sound to tell us those pumps are on. There's no indication that they're on other than the fact that the caution lights go out. So that's correct. What we need to do now is, from memory, by the checklist, we leave the fuel levers off, then we spin up the engine. I'm not going, again, we should spin up the engine and watch the gas generator gauge. That doesn't move. We do get a sound effect there, so it's spinning up, and then introduce fuel. Now that should, according to the checklist, start the engine. Is it doing that? Well, the oil pressure went up. We're hearing sound, but it doesn't start. That doesn't seem to work. It may be that I have this switch mapped incorrectly. But if I hold this switch and watch the prop spin up, I think if I let go now, that looks like it's going to work properly. Certainly sounds like it's worked properly. If I look at the gauges, so the T5's up, the oil pressure's up, oil temperatures not really moving. That looks like that engine started correctly. Now my track hour stopped, I don't know why that is. So the engine's running, let's get the other one running as well. Same deal, we'll just put it fuel lever forward. In fact, we'll do it with the virtual cockpit control this time, just to see if it works any differently. So in fact, let's leave that fuel lever off. I'll click the start switch to the right, start switch to the left, and then put the fuel in. That looks like it's coming up, the T5's come right up, prop RPM's rising, oil pressure's up. Okay, so that appears that does start according to the checklist with the roughly correct sequence. So we got the engines running. Next stop, let's have a look. We need to put the generators on. We've got generator caution lights. Again, we've got to do this bit of a neck stretch to reach the generator. Whoops. Oh god. I just did something. Right. Generators. On. So those caution lights should have gone out. We've got pneumatic low pressure, that's about the bleed air. If we turn the bleed air switches on, where are they? There they are. Left is on, right is on. We notice that caution light's gone out, that's wrong. We shouldn't have bleed air pressure on idle power setting. That should be on until we get a significant torque reading. The other thing I've noticed is, and I won't do this, well Lisa will do this, if we could go and turn one of those bleed air switches back off, we get the caution light back. And even if I wind the power up, that pneumatic low pressure caution light stays on. Now, I think that's wrong as well. I mean, it says in the handbook for this aircraft, the RW Designs model, that if either of the bleed air switches has low pressure, that's what triggers the caution light. My understanding of the real aircraft is the bleed air is one system that's fed from either or both engines. So that's a rough edge. Let's look at some more rough edges. Looking at these load meters, the switch is in the central position, which means we should be seeing the load on the battery. Now, two things here. The battery voltage is showing, well, that's actually the bus voltage, because the battery, so the generators are connected to the same bus as the battery. That should be reading 28 volts. It's way under reading, that's about 19, 18 volts. The DC load should be 0, that's the load on the battery. It's showing full scale deflection. The right generator load is showing 0, the battery is showing full scale deflection, left generator is showing full scale deflection. You know, that's not rational. I don't know what's going on there. So that doesn't seem to work. I'm not even going to tinker with that anymore. What else can we say about the electrical system? Right. There's a claim in the description for this aircraft that it has a custom electrical system, and in the fairly short and superficial handbook that you get with this aircraft, it talks about the things like the inverters. The inverter switch is behind my head. I can't get a sight of that. But the bus tie switch, the generator switches, in particular, it talks about those. But if you go up here and you switch the external battery switch to off, first thing you notice is that all the electrical equipment goes off. Now that renders everything else about the electrical system meaningless, because you can't check out any of the bus logic. It's impossible to check it out. What should happen is, we've got the battery off but the generators are connected. The electrical system should still be powered by the DC buses that are fed from the generators. Then if we were to untie the buses, we'd get into a situation where it matters whether the left generator or the right generator or both generators are on or off, and so we'd switch the left and right generators on and off, and we'd see different things starting up and shutting down. So So that's a rough edge as well, if you want to call it that. I don't know whether this stuff is modelled and that's just a bug that means we can't check it out, or if it's actually not modelled at all. External power, I think in this aircraft makes some kind of sense. That has no effect unless you go down to this menu and switch on the external power unit. Yeah, so you saw the electrical stuff came, well, the radios at least, that's interesting, the radios came on, the instruments came live. Now the GNS 530 is not on. I don't know why that makes any sense. If we were to leave that external power supply connected but flip the battery switch to battery, the GNS 530 comes back on. I have no idea really whether that makes any sense, but for now we're going to leave the battery switch on. The electrics are up. Again, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to go through every little bug or rough edge. I'm going to go through enough of them to convince you that they're indicative of the, you know, the wider level of detail really. Fuel pumps. If I turn on, I want to do this with sight of the caution lights as well. I don't know if you can see those because they might be behind the throttle cord. Hopefully you can see all of that. Okay, if I flip off the forward boost pump, first of all we get pneumatic low pressure. That I've already explained why that's a bug. We get correct indication on the caution panel that that pump has gone offline, but the engine stops. Now that shouldn't happen because there should be and this is a problem that the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended has as well, there should be an engine driven fuel pump that keeps the engine going regardless of electrical power. That's not modelled obviously. So we turn the forward boost pump back on, we'll spin the engine back up, so the caution light is out, the engine appears to have started again. That's good. We're going to what I'm going to do now is down here I'm going to flip on the standby boost pump for the forward tank, which feeds the right engine. I flip that on and then I'm going to flip off the main forward boost pump, so we get the caution light again and the engine stops again, which means that basically that standby boost pump doesn't do anything. Now whether it's meant to do something and it's got a bug in it, or whether it just isn't modelled except that there's a switch for it, who knows. But again, just you know, a rough edge. So we've got the main boost pump back on, start that engine back up. Okay, so we've got the engines running again. One more thing to say about the fuel system before we move on. So the standby boost pumps are not modelled. We have the fuel selector here. On normal, the aft fuel tank feeds the left engine and the forward fuel tank feeds the right engine. We can switch to fuel both engines from the same tank. So if we go to both on, which way does this go? Both on aft, we should get caution lights signalling that the combination of boost pumps that are in use. So I forget exactly the detail here, but since we're feeding both engines on the aft, from the aft tank, the forward boost pumps should go offline. So we get caution lights for those. We don't get that. Whether or not this is actually feeding fuel from the aft tank into both engines, I haven't determined that. I'd have to fly around for a bit and see which gauges change. But likewise, if we go back to normal, then both and forward, again we don't get any caution lights. So that's wrong. something I haven't checked out, we do have pumps for the wing tanks. Those are on, off. Now that is just truly bizarre as well. Does that make any sense of anything? I've switched the wing tanks off. Those are auxiliary tanks. Switched off the boost pumps for the wing tanks, which were on, and the engines have stopped. And we don't have any caution lights for the fuel boost pumps. Now that suggests, I'm not even sure what that suggests. That suggests that no, to me there's no logic to that. That might have suggested that we were running the engines off the wing tanks solely, and that by turning off the boost pumps we've starved the engines, although again, as I said earlier, there should be the engine driven fuel pumps, and given that the tanks are not dry, they should be feeding the engines. But if that were the case, it wouldn't make any sense that turning off the main boost pumps would stop the engine. So, I'm not going to attempt to make any sense of that. That's just completely faulty behaviour. Who knows what's going on with that? What's that switch down there? Vent fan, I'm sure that can do anything. So that's the fuel system, which appears to be, barely modelled at all, and to the extent that it is modelled, it appears to be faulty. I think we've got both engines going now. While we're here, I'll just show you one last I say that for now, one last rough edge. Coming back to this panel up here and the ignition switch. We're at normal ignition, which is the ignition fires, that's the spark essentially, during the startup sequence, and then it stops because we don't need that. The fire, if you like, inside the engine is self-sustaining. But for reasons for situations where we might risk a flame out, we can switch it to continuous ignition, or manual as it's labelled. What that should mean is the igniters fire continually, and if we interrupt the fuel supply momentarily, the engine should immediately relight. So if we do that, if you watch if I'll put the fuel levers in full view, I'm going to momentarily interrupt the right hand fuel supply and then back. And what's actually happening is the engine's spinning down, so we've lost all the gauges. If we look out there, we can see the prop spinning down. So continuous ignition, that's not implemented either. The setting of that switch makes no difference. If I just leave it where it is, it should restart the engine. But the point is, it should have restarted the engine automatically. But that's not implemented. Now that has implications for flying in, well, it should have implications for flying in turbulence, for flying in icing conditions, and probably other situations that I can't call to mind. Alright, so I think it's time to go flying. we're just gonna taxi out. Onto runway 24, 0624 Fullerton. Gonna take off. This is kind of, I'll try and mimic the flight I did in the first video. We're not going to use the entire length of the runway here. We should manage to get it off from here. I hope. I say that. Doesn't look that long. So what we'll do, well, let's just do it. I'll talk as I go up. We're going to put down 10 degrees, 1 notch of flap. I'm just going to give it full power because in this aircraft it doesn't seem to really put it anywhere near the torque or temperature limits. Just checking that by looking at the instruments. We got off just in time there. This is default scenery. We've got the HD mesh installed underneath that. Going to hook it round, crosswind, a little bit early, but who's counting? Get the flaps in also, probably a little bit premature. This is the airport where I actually learned to fly, Fullerton. Although it's a bit of a distant memory now. You know, one time this would have been familiar to me. I think the layout of the roads and the railways looks somewhat familiar, but you know, not for a long time. We're going to go to the east and then the south and fly down the coast to McClellan Palomar. There's the airfield down there. We want to set up the El Toro VOR. I'm going to do that by looking at the GPS to get the data. We've got the nearest VOR. El Toro is, I think ELB, is that the one? Okay, ELB 117.2. We're going to put that onto nav 117.2. If we watch the HSI while we do that, I'm going to flip it over now. So we've got an indication. There's no flag on there, incidentally, showing when. Maybe we dialed into something else. 117.8. Okay. Oh, 117.8. Yeah, we're actually, there's no flag because we've got something else dialed in, but we can center it up. Whoops, that's the heading bug. I'm doing this in my hardware panel just because I've got these things hooked up as well. So that's telling us we want to steer about this direction. We'll just follow that by eye for now. And I can see, if I look at the GPS, that's 13.0 miles away. Now I've done some experimenting with the flying in this aircraft. I'm not going to repeat all the experiments I did in the first video. A couple of things to know. The behaviour with feathering one of the props and the lack of drag effects, that's the same. Yeah, I think that's really not down to the model itself. You know, that's probably explain default behaviour. Although having said that, I did do some experiments in the Beach Baron, and that suggested there was the default X-plane behaviour did model, I think, transient but quite major drag effects when you feather a prop. Anyway, this doesn't seem to behave differently to the version 1 of the Twin Otter. The other thing to mention, which in a way repairs something I said in the earlier video. I was a little bit scathing of the flight model because it doesn't give major pitch variations under power changes. Now I was comparing that behaviour with the behaviour of the twin Otter extended, and through discussions with other people and indeed through consultation with people who basically know what they're talking about, I've come to accept that the twin Otter extended actually doesn't model the pitching behaviour under power realistically, and the behaviour of this model, the RW Designs, is somewhat more realistic, and realistic in the sense that it's conventional. It's what you'd expect from most aircraft. When you pull the power back, we should get a net pitch down, which we're getting now if you watch the nose. And then if we push the power forward, we should get a net and possibly quite significant pitch up, depending obviously on how much we've changed the power setting. And that's what you'd expect from most aircraft, and it's what you'd expect in a safe design in a way. If the engines quit, it doesn't really make sense for the nose to then skyrocket. So I was a little bit unfair perhaps on this RW Designs Twin Otter version 1 in my original video. But that said, the behaviour is otherwise pretty much, at first, we haven't done too much flying in this version 2 yet. It's only been out a week. Doesn't behave too much differently to the version 1, but it flies, pretty okay. It's not by any means on rails, to use that hackneyed phrase, but it's not too unpredictable in its handling. If we, when I get to the approach, we'll look at the behaviour under flaps, putting the flaps in and out. That's El Toro down below. We'll fly a little bit off there to the coast, and I'm going to talk about the Autopilot. Now, sad to say, the criticisms I had of the Autopilot in version 1 remain in version 2. There seems to be very little, if any, difference. Although, having said that, there's some difference in the arrangement and the specifics of the navigational instruments. I can't remember what those specifics are, honestly, but at the moment, let's tell you what we've got. We've got the GNS-530, which is our main controller of the nav1 and indeed the COM1 radio, as well as the GPS. That can be the Autopilot can be slaved to that in either GPS mode or nav mode. I don't know what you call it, the other mode, radio instrument mode. We have an addition, I think this is an addition, we have a switch here that switches nav1 and nav2. So we have a nav2 radio in the stack. We actually have a nav1 radio in the stack as well, and a COM1 radio, which is a duplication of the GNS-530. But I guess that makes some kind of sense if you swap out the GNS for something else. But you can, if you tune in a nav station on nav2, not only is it displayed on the nav2 instrument, which is over here, and we have glide slope and localizer capability on that, and indeed, as an aside to an aside, we have that instrument duplicated on the co-pilot side. They are the same instrument, but they do have independently settable omni bearing selectors, which conceivably could be useful. But as I was saying, you can dial in something on the nav2 radio, and then you can flip the switch, which will slave the Autopilot to nav2 instead of nav1. Now, what it doesn't do, which I think it should do, which is, I mean, you could argue whether this is a bug or an omission. When you flip that to nav2, it doesn't slave the HSI to nav2 instead of nav1. which I say that it should do. I mean, it should do logically in my mind, but also I'm going by the fact that the gauge on the Air Manager panel does display nav2 instead of nav1, and I think that is the correct behaviour. But it's a relatively small omission, given that we do have the glide slope and the localizer information displayed on the nav2 instruments. So let's talk about the Autopilot specifically. I'm going to drive the Autopilot for the time being using the mouse, which is going to be a little bit cumbersome. I'm going to put us into a pitch up and a major left bank, and I'm going to flip the Autopilot on. Okay, no lateral or vertical mode selected. The Autopilot rolls us wings level and pitches us to what? And it's going to settle down. It's not quite wings level actually. It's pitched us to 10 degrees up ish and wings slightly shy of level. But that's not the attitude that we had. What it should do is it should hold the attitude we dialed in. If I do it's hard to click that while it's moving in the track IR. If I turn that off, I'll put us into a downward bank and pitch us to the right, and then flip Autopilot on and let go. Again, it doesn't hold the bank, it doesn't hold the pitch, and in fact it returns to that mysterious slightly left of level and 10 degrees up. Now the significance of that escapes me, but it's not doing what it should do. That should be a pitch hold mode. It should hold the pitch that's in operation when we select the Autopilot on. Now I have talked about this in the support forum, and actually the designer of the aircraft has acknowledged that that behaviour isn't designed in. He basically hasn't implemented the pitch, the attitude hold mode, and it's possible he's going to look into that and possibly implement it in a future update for this aircraft. But for now, that's the main omission of the Autopilot. Now from now on, I'm going to just, because having demonstrated that, I mean there are other ways that behaviour becomes pathological in a sense, but I've described those in my original video, and there's no point harping on about them now. We know what the problem is. The problem is it's just not implemented, and when what you have to do is basically you have to steer clear of using the Autopilot without any of the lateral or vertical mode selected, because it just doesn't work properly. So that said, everything else I do with the Autopilot in the rest of the video I'm going to do using my hardware controls, which are programmed up. So I'm going to select heading mode, select Autopilot on, I'm going to select altitude hold and heading mode. Oops, I should have selected the heading first. I'm going to bring the heading bug around. If you watch that on there, it's coming around. Take us pretty much down the coast. Again, I mentioned this in the first video, we do get a kind of overshoot tendency. That is configurable, I'm told, in X-Plane. If you go in, I can't remember how you configure it, but you can go in and tweak some configuration setting. Everything else works more or less conventionally in the Autopilot. If we just reset that direct to, and then we go on to make sure we're on I'm going to make sure we're on GPS mode, and then I'm going to select nav hold. So we're going to turn onto that course that takes us directly to Palomar, and we're holding altitude at about we're high up, 14,400 feet. Let's say we're too high there. If we go down, if we put it for 10,000 feet, I'm going to select that on the altitude alert pre-select. This is not mapped to my hardware panel, so I'm doing this with the mouse, the scroll wheel. 10,000 feet, sorry, that's me on the rudder. and I'm going to click altitude alert. Oh, okay, that bug. Yep, this is, well, I think it's a bug. Bug or feature, you decide. Altitude alert has no effect because we're on altitude hold mode. Now, I think what should happen is when you press altitude alert, it should deselect altitude hold, select altitude alert. Altitude hold off, altitude alert on. Okay, it's selected that now, but nothing happens because we have to begin the descent manually. So the only way to do that in this variation of the Twin Otter is to click airspeed hold, reduce power, and then we should see it nose down. Now there should be other ways to do that. We don't have the pitch and turn panel which goes along with the attitude hold mode of the autopilot. If we had that, we should be able to nudge the pitch and the bank of the aircraft using the two dials. But we don't have that. The other thing we should be able to do is press the, we don't have the, if I show the yoke again just temporarily, if those buttons were labelled, one of those buttons would say CWS, control wheel steering, and we could click that button which disconnects the autopilot servos, excuse me. We could then position the aircraft in pitch and bank with the yoke, let go of the switch, and it would then hold that new position. So to begin a descent we just pitch it down. So we don't have that. That's not implemented. But we're in a descent, we're in a rapid descent about 1300 feet per minute. We're passing through 12,500 feet, heading for 10,000. And the altitude alerter should, first of all, it should tell us when we're getting close to that, and second of all, it should then kick in the altitude hold mode to hold us there. Now we're almost at Palomar now. We should be overhead really. We're going to continue. We're going to go to heading mode. Now the altitude alerter has now got an indication on there. We didn't get an audible indication, which we do in the Twin Otter Extended. But that came on correctly when we're within 1,000 feet of our target altitude. We're now passing through 10,500 feet, and that should go out at 200 feet to go, which is coming up right about now. So that's gone out, that worked correctly. Altitude alert light's gone off. We're on altitude hold mode. We should be pitching up and then levelling out at 10,000. So that seems to be working. Let's go on to heading hold mode. That should take us off roughly in that direction. We'll just go out a little bit over the sea, and then we'll think about coming down and landing. Another thing I've noticed about the autopilot, which I don't think is correct, I'm off autopilot at the moment. I'm manipulating the trim wheel by hand, and we're getting these trim indicators on the autopilot panel. Now I can't swear that's incorrect, but it doesn't make sense, you know, because it's not the autopilot, that's the autopilot panel, and that's, you know, the fact that I'm adjusting the trim has got nothing to do with the autopilot. So maybe that's right or maybe that's wrong. There's the field. If we aim pretty much for the field now, we should be okay height wise. So this is Oceanside, McClellan Palomar, dead ahead, and we're pretty much getting onto our approach speed from here. We can go to 1 notch of flaps. Now we didn't get too much of a pitch excursion there, although we have taken a hit with the speed. So we're now at about 80 knots, which is kind of what we want. A little bit of power back in. We don't want to let it speed up too much. And I'm going to go to the second stage of flaps. Now I think in real life the flaps don't go out in stages. You have this knob up here, which is a sort of manual with a slider with a friction control. So you can select intermediate flap settings, but I have it set up to just come out in 4 increments, which match the graduations on the flap lever and also on the indicator here. Well, actually technically there's 8 increments shown on the indicator. So I'm going to go to 3 30% flaps, or 30 degrees, whatever that is. We're at about, just before I do that, I'm holding it at about 80 knots. When I go to that stage of flaps, we get a major pitch excursion there, which we have to hold by pushing forward, otherwise we lose a lot of speed. We need a lot of forward trim to trim that out, and we do need to come on the power to keep that descent rate more or less consistent. Now really that suggests to me we should hold off the final 2 stages of flaps till we're really on short final. But again, we're at about 80 knots now. This is a fairly good approach angle. It's fairly steep, but I mean there are pylons and wires right in front of us, so that's what we need. And I'm going to go to the 4th stage of flap just in a second. Well, I'll do it now. And we're going to get that same pitch up tendency, which you have to counter by forward trim, and I'm down to 70 some knots there, coming back on the power quite a lot, coming down to 65 knots. I'm going to start to flare it now, roll off the rest of the power. Oops, I'm not sure. It's hard to tell whether I bounced or ballooned there because there's almost no touchdown sounds. I could get reverse. I don't need reverse because I landed very slowly. And there's reverse. So that was okay. You know, that's a nicely controllable approach. The flap effects were what we'd expect. Fairly easy landing. I don't think there's any appreciable wind, couldn't sense any crosswind there. And here we are at Palomar. Put in the flaps before we come off the runway. So in summary, what to say about this aircraft? Well, you know, for my money it's disappointing. I was hoping, you know, I want to stick with X-Plane, or at least, you know, do some serious experimentation with X-Plane, and I had high hopes for, I mean, I didn't know this model was going to be released, so it was a bit of a surprise, but when I saw it I had high hopes that we were going to take a step up in terms of X-Plane aircraft quality, and I grabbed it. And it's been a little bit of a disappointment, mainly because nothing much that was wrong in version 1, you know, for my money, has really improved. And in terms of how well it stands up to the equivalent aircraft in FSX, which is the Twin Otter Extended, you know, there just is no comparison. Visually, okay, it's getting into the same ballpark as I said, but visually really doesn't count much beyond how the virtual cockpit looks. The ergonomics are fine now, that's what we can say. But in terms of systems modelling, you know, not only doesn't it compare with the Twin Otter Extended, really there is no systems modelling in this aircraft beyond, as I said, what's built on top of the default functionality for navigation, GPS, you know, the lighting and all of that sort of stuff. None of this electrical system or hydraulic system or what else, fuel system, is credibly modelled in any meaningful way, and such things that are or that do purport to be modelled really aren't. You know, this aircraft purports to be a high quality payware offering, and okay, it sells for 25% less than the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended, which is the nearest equivalent in FSX or prepared, and is really the benchmark for this aircraft in the virtual world. But the attention to detail in this aircraft is below what you ought to expect for something you're going to pay just shy of $30 for. Now, another way of looking at this is, and coming back to the direct comparison with the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended, there is an argument to say that the degree of modelling in the Aerosoft model in some sense is an irrelevance, because at the end of the day, to have a detailed electrical system modelled is inconsequential in the day-to-day operation of this aircraft, because it's meaningless, it's no use. It allows you to go through and tinker with things, and they sort of all logically stand up to scrutiny, but the fact is there's no electrical system failures will ever happen in FSX, and likewise all the detailed modelling of the checklist stuff in the Aerosoft model. So coming full circle then to the Twin Otter from RW Designs version 2, the fact that there are very few systems modelled isn't that important. If you jump in this aircraft, you can go through some semblance of a startup sequence. It's very superficial and unrealistic, but you have to do it. You have to get the aircraft started, and then you can fly it around and navigate and land and so on. And the lack of detailed systems modelling is somewhat irrelevant. If the aeroplane flies reasonably well, it navigates using all the functionality of the Autopilot and the radio systems, and you've got control over the engines and the props and the flaps and so on. That's like 99% of your experience of flying the aircraft, and then you add weather on top of that, and really the end-to-end experience is fairly good. So I think that's all I've got to say about this for now. Can I sum that up in a sentence or two? It's expensive for what it is. Don't expect detailed modelling of any systems. Do expect it to look nicer and to be actually kind of nice to fly from the virtual cockpit, and you'll get a credible end-to-end experience of flying this, as long as you don't expect to acquire a real Twin Otter pilot's operating handbook and be able to match behaviour of any of the systems to the real world. And of course, if it matters to you that the outside of the aircraft looks nice, or that you can wander back into the cabin and see that the no smoking signs come on when you press the appropriate switch in the cockpit, or you can open the cargo doors and so on, well, maybe it's got all that going for it as well. But at the end of the day, for me, it's a cheap and cheerful aircraft that's somewhat nicer to fly from the cockpit now, that flies credibly, and as long as you don't take it too seriously, it's probably going to have some lasting value.